everybody. Your Excellencies, thank you so much. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today. It's a real honor to be here. And I've got to say, my name is Joanna Versace. I'm a Bloomberg TV anchor. And the name of our show is actually called Horizons, which is a bit of a theme this year for FII. But then specifically, our show is called Horizons Middle East and Africa. And every single day, we have daily commentary on the stories that are driving the narratives, investment narratives, not only in the Middle East, but also in Africa as well. This morning, we were doing a whole report about the fact that South Africa has had 7 months now of no power outages. So really excited to be here. And I know it is very important to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia as well. 1 year ago, exactly, I had the pleasure of moderating a panel at the IMF alongside His Excellency, Mr. Jadhan, and we were talking about the debt priorities and the priorities that could be put forward to help reduce the debt burden on some of these lower income nations, African nations, because so many of them are buckling under the weight of high debt loads, high servicing costs, and that is one of the big structural issues that is facing the continent, alongside some other challenges as well. The African Development Bank has cited over-reliance on commodity-led growth, inadequate infrastructure in some cases, low access to affordable financing, and of course, in some situations, recurrent conflicts as well. But those are the challenges. However, the potential is rich. This is a vibrant continent. The demographics are very promising. By 2040, we're looking at a population of 1.1 billion, very rich in natural resources, increasing amount of intra-continental trades, corridors being opened up, supply chains being strengthened. So there are plenty of opportunities. And I'm not going to speak anymore. let's hand it over to Your Excellency. It's wonderful to be here. How do we challenge, how do we channel the potential that I just highlighted in the African continent and turn them into opportunities?
Well, thank you, Jumana. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. And I would like to reiterate what His Excellency Mohammed Al-Jadhan said at the beginning of the session today, of welcoming everyone first, thanking Richard and the FII for convening this summit and this gathering and getting us to talk about a very important topic. I think it goes without saying, and it's been mentioned, but I'll mention it again because if it's important, that Saudi Arabia has always considered itself very close to Africa. In fact, sometimes we consider ourselves also African. I think if you think of the Red Sea rift, it's relatively in geologic time a young and recent rift, and Saudi Arabia was very much, the Arabian Peninsula was very much an extension of Africa. If you look at the ethnic composition in Africa, many of them trace their roots and their origin to the Arabian Peninsula, which is essentially Saudi Arabia. Arabic is widely spoken, not only in Northern Africa, but in East Africa. And indeed, if you look at Saudi Arabia itself, our genetic makeup, our skin complex, and all of that has strong content from Africa that we're very proud of. The cultures are similar. A third of the African population are Muslims, but other ethnicities and religions within Africa are very much close to us. Trade is strong. We have about $45 billion of trade with Africa and significant investments from Saudi Arabia. And of course, development aid, as His Excellency mentioned, has been extended close to $45 billion also in most of the African continent, the majority of countries. The challenges in Africa, I would reverse the previous proverb mentioned, and that when Africa sneezes, indeed the rest of the world catches a cold. It is the heart of the planet in many ways. Africa today has 18% of the global population. Is that a problem, or is that a dividend that Africa should, and the rest of the world indeed, harness as the world goes through aging and human resources become scarce? And it's a very young population. Africa has a third of the global mineral resources. Much of it has not been developed and exploited. And we are initiating today in the global economy an era where minerals are going to be the fuel, the new fuel for the next phase of economic development. There is significant rainfall in sub-Saharan Africa, and significant land mass that has not been also developed fully. And modern agriculture is lacking, and also being able to raise livestock and create enough protein, not only for the African population, which is going to be a quarter of the global population, but indeed Africa can be the bread basket and the food basket for the rest of the world. Certainly for us in the Arabian Peninsula, the GCC, Saudi Arabia, we see a great potential. And the list goes on of the potential of Africa that needs to be unleashed without exaggeration to create solutions not only for its young population, rising population, and its aspiring economies, but for surrounding regions like the Arabian Peninsula, GCC, Saudi Arabia, and very much the rest of the planet if we think of our common. For that, I would just end, we need to work together to mobilize finance. I think development aid, His Excellency talked about what we're doing within the context of Saudi Arabia, the GCC, Islamic Development Bank, but also within the context of the World Bank Group and IMF and the relief we have provided during G20 leadership of the Kingdom and since then. But we need to combine that development aid with investment by owner-operator companies. Many of them in Saudi Arabia are very, very active in Africa, and they're very bullish and ambitious about the great potential, some of the things I just mentioned, and beyond. And Saudi companies are active there. We need to bring financial institutions from the private sector to work. We need to produce the perceived or real country risk. For that, I would just end my first intervention by saying, we don't want to help Africa. We want to work with Africa to create opportunity for investors. And for that, Africa needs to do what we heard. Africa needs to first help itself. We need better governance. We need transparency on policies by the government, laws and regulations. We need technology. I think one thing I want to mention, in addition to traditional investments, what Saudi Arabia can do by deploying modern technology that has enabled the transformation that many of you are seeing in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Technology is a big enabler. Saudi Arabia, from a laggard to a leader in digitalization and education, digitalization in healthcare, where we have virtual hospitals reaching people across our large country, as well as digitizing government. And then we need to address urbanization, which is a great challenge, by creating smart cities, again, by mobilizing finance and deploying technology in these smart cities.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Well, lucky we have a former minister on our panel, former Minister of Economy and Planning for the Senegal Corporation. So you have unique insight into what it takes to attract and mobilize capital. And I just wonder, from your perspective, how important do you think it is to have sound public finances in order to become an attractive investment destination?
Thank you very much, Jumana. It's a great pleasure to be here, as always. I think it is extremely important to have sound public finances and making sure that we are mobilizing more resources domestically, in particular increasing the fiscal space so that we can get more revenue, and when you get more revenue, you get a better rating. And when you get a better rating, that affects your capacity to raise more money, but also it affects the quality and the capacity of the fundraising of your private sector. In most countries, the private sector rating is sealed by the country, basically sovereign rating. That is extremely important. Number two, the ability to prepare bankable projects at scale. It's not 1, 2 projects in a country. It's hundreds of projects, thousands of projects to address the infrastructure gap and to make sure that money managers like our brother here, Bayo, and others, Tony, and everyone else who want to invest in Africa, see actually bankable projects. And bankable projects, it takes the government, it takes the private sector to basically work together, and it takes, more importantly, skills. And once you have all those ingredients, implementing projects also on the ground. That's why it's not only about policy, it's also about skills, about training people so that we have the ability basically to implement fast. When you look at the MDBs, a lot of resources can be mobilized, but sometimes the implementation takes a lot of time. And Africa is in a hurry. We are going to sort of train many more people so that we can sort of implement extremely fast. And then one last point actually is the cost of financing, both for the governments, but also for basically the private sector. You know, once the African countries have the same rating than other countries in other regions, the credit spread is extremely high. I was looking at more than 15 countries, comparing them to other countries. Countries that have the same rating, Africa can pay up to 500 basis points more, meaning that when the other country pays 5% on a bond, African governments pay 10% on the bond. So 500 basis points over 20 years on a $1 billion loan is another $1 billion of extra cost, and that can make countries more in debt vulnerability if those issues also are not addressed.
Debt servicing is an issue. Before I move on, I know that you're running to be president for the African Development Bank. And not to make this a whole question about that, but I think it is worth asking where you think the biggest areas for development are.
You know, the concessional, the need to access concessional money is extremely important because you cannot finance infrastructure with short-term money and very expensive money. You cannot finance capacity building, education, human capital without also cheap money. But also, most of the money is in the private sector. And how to attract more private sector money? It's been said before, policies, but also developing more projects. That's why during my last mission at the African Development Bank, I was raising a fund for project preparation and development for green infrastructure. Within 18 months, we raised about $300 million from donor countries, from philanthropy, from MDBs, and that will allow us to develop more than $6 billion of projects to make them bankable for debt to come in, private debt, but also for equity to come in, private equity, and implement it without increasing the borrowing of the government. So we talk about moving from billions to trillions, but to make that happen, project preparation and project development is critical. If projects are not bankable, the money will sit there at lower yielding assets while Africa needs that. So let's put all our resources together to develop bankable projects at scale. 6 countries in Africa needed $30 billion of project development money to make sure they achieve their infrastructure gap. Only 6 countries. Imagine the need for 54 countries. So I'm rooting for more project preparation, more project development, so we can have more private sector resources going into Africa. Thank you.
Adebayo, I've been told I can call you Bayo, so
Please
I'm going to allow myself to have the liberty. The CEO of BlackRock, Larry Fink, said recently, private markets are becoming increasingly important in the financing of the economy. So much so that BlackRock acquired your firm for $12.5 billion earlier this year. Clearly, the work that you're doing in infrastructure caught the attention of BlackRock. Can you give us a sense for how you see the infrastructure opportunity right now in Africa, and just talk to us about the extent of the footprint your firm has in the African continent?
Well, first, thanks for having me. Richard, thanks for the invitation. I appreciate it. And Tony, thanks for the kind words. Look, you've heard from His Excellency, you've heard from Tony what the conditions are that African governments need to have to encourage private capital. Let me state from the beginning, what I do is invest private capital in infrastructure. So you're going to expect to hear from me the virtues of private capital, okay? So what do African countries need to do to attract private capital? First, we actually need to be more realistic, okay? Africa is in competition. We're competing with Latin America, we're competing with the US, we're competing with Europe, we're competing with the GCC. There is, other than minerals, there is no reason why anybody has to invest in Africa, okay? And so African countries have to realize, we need to realize that we're in competition and therefore make it attractive for private capital to come to the continent. That's the first thing. The second thing is we also need to be more realistic about how we think about these things. We looked at investing some electricity projects on the continent. And the response I got from the government was, well, the cost of electricity is too expensive, okay? 40% of the African continent has no access to electricity. Tony Elumulu's companies have to have diesel-fired generation to supply electricity in Africa. In Nigeria, in the 21st century, Nigeria has less electricity generating capacity than some mid-sized city in the US, okay? What is the cost of the 40% of the Africans who do not have access to electricity? Yeah. That's the way you should think about it. So any amount you spend to get central generation of electricity makes it more attractive. So that's the other thing. We've heard from His Excellency about how Africa has the youngest population. By, I think, 2050, the working age population in Africa will increase from roughly 800 million to about 1.5 billion. That is in an environment where the US will stay flat, Europe is declining, China is declining. That creates a tremendous opportunity for Africa to be the service economy of the world. But that's also a challenge, because if you can't create jobs for these young people, it's going to create political and economic problems. There is also the fact that you don't have all the time in the world. Yeah. Artificial intelligence is coming. Artificial intelligence, artificial general intelligence will increase productivity in most of these other countries. And so if we don't move quickly in Africa, we will find ourselves in a situation where what should be an asset could become a liability. So these are some of the things that I think we need to be thoughtful about as we think about how to attract capital to invest in Africa.
Specifically on infrastructure, I saw infrastructure needs alone are estimated by the African Development Bank at around $180 to $220 billion per year over the next 5 years. How can that gap be closed?
As what?
How can that gap be closed?
The only way to close that gap is through private capital. And this is not an Africa-only problem. This is a global problem. If you think about the fact, today I think debt to GDP ratios in Africa are 60%. The cost of servicing that debt is going up. With all due respect to my friend from the African Development Bank, there is not enough resources in the multilateral agencies to close that gap. So the only way you can close that gap is by encouraging private capital. So you have to create the right sort of environment to encourage private capital. Yeah. That's the opportunity, but that's also the challenge that Africa has.
Well, that takes me nicely to our virtual guest today, Thiam. It's good to see you. I don't know if you can see us, but it's good to have you with us on the panel. You are in a unique position because you also, you've worked on both sides of the industry, being CEO of Prudential, CEO of Credit Suisse. You have unique insights into how investors think about the credit premium, the risk premium of investing into the continent. And of course, now you are leaning into policymaking in Côte d'Ivoire. Let me just ask you, wearing perhaps your former hat, what you think the biggest hurdles are to get this private capital into the continent, and how do you allay people's concerns about the credit premium?
Right, thank you again for having me. I'd like to thank the Saudi authorities for organizing this event and say hello to my friend Richard Atias and to all the panelists. Let me try and address this. A few points. I'd like to pick up where Bayo left things. The importance of private capital coming in. And I'd like to turn this on its head, because I think we focus too much on attracting foreign investment. Foreign investment is a reward that will come as a result of you managing properly your domestic economy. So my focus and my advice to all African governments is make sure that you have a thriving domestic private sector. The attempts that you will make to attract foreign capital, if life is very difficult for your homegrown domestic entrepreneurs, are bound to fail. The things that will allow domestic firms to thrive are the same things that will allow foreign capital to flow in. The first thing you look at as a foreign investor, if you're not in natural resources, is how is it for companies that are native, that speak the language, that understand the economy. If you can produce a company of reasonable size and reasonably successful in your own country, I will not come in, I will not invest. So that's really number one. That goes into the issue of equity. I think there is too much focus on debt in the way often we think about financing the economy. The real missing link in the economic model is equity capital. What is purely insufficient in African economies, is equity capital. And if you think about the capital that Bayo talked about, that's in the Western and developed economies, it's mostly pension funds money. BlackRock is managing mostly pension funds money. Okay, the source of long-term capital in the economy, the source of equity, is savings and long-term savings and pensions. And actually, this is something I'm really working on. We have this young population. It is absolutely urgent to develop some quality domestic institutional investors who can invest in local currency and invest in local firms and then crowd in external capital. So developing sources of capital in those economies, focusing on SMEs. Everybody talk about the demography, the need to create jobs, and the opportunities are huge. People mentioned, the supply chain, that's one area. I would say a word about energy. I mean, solar. Solar is an amazing opportunity in Africa. Solar is today the cheapest and cleanest form of energy. If you see that California is now deriving 30% of its energy from solar. I was going around the west of Côte d'Ivoire last week, and I was going to those classes, but no electricity. If you think about the electricity bill of just the education sector, it's huge. And I told the kids, I'll put a panel on every one of your classrooms. And you'll not only have lighting, you will have also air conditioning, and those are riots. So I was half joking, but the opportunity is gigantic in Africa. Solar today is, it can be a game changer for African economies, especially to reach into remote areas. One of the panelists said 40% of people don't have access to electricity. With solar, you don't need to draw expensive electric lines, and this is something I'm sure you will agree with, but there are huge opportunities there. So to summarize really, equity capital, development of equity capital, because then you can have debt, and you will not be locked into the kind of debt crisis that we have every 10 to 15 years. Focusing on a healthy domestic environment with a rule of law, predictable policy, business-friendly environment, and then finally having innovative solutions using, as the minister said, technology, digitalization, things like health. We train very few doctors, they're very expensive to train. Telehealth puts a doctor in every village. So there are huge opportunities if you think about the upside. But for that, we need a more realistic approach. I agree with Bayo. For me, you can't argue with the market. The price of risk, it's a given. Then you need to work on how to reduce that risk premium. Okay. But that will come through hard work, consistent investment in education, and a reasonable policy framework.
Fantastic, thank you. Sim, I'd like to move on to you. Speaking about risk premium, but also sentiment matters. And I think South Africa is a good example this year because there were elections that took place, and post-elections, it feels as though some of that positive investor sentiment is back. Just looking at the performance of how the currency has done, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, since elections have actually had a good run. Do you agree that the sentiment towards South Africa has taken a turn for the better in the last few months? And also, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, it's been 7 months with no power outages, which makes a big difference to the South African economy.
Jumana, yes, indeed. Thank you very, very much for the opportunity, and thank you to the Saudi Arabian authorities for this fantastic event. So firstly, South Africa compared to Denmark. Denmark is rated AAA, South Africa BB-. And yet, if you look at the institutions, you look at the structures, you look at the policies and the processes, it's really hard to understand why there's such a big difference. There's a study done by Africa Practice, which speaks to this issue around the cost for the African continent arising from the perceptions that my colleagues were making reference to. And that cost is roughly $4.2 billion per annum. The UNCTAD, the UNDP has done a study last year where they make this very point, that the idiosyncrasy and the subjective factors going into risk assessments by ratings agencies contribute to roughly $75 billion in added costs and foregone revenues by African countries. And so this perception issue does make a massive difference and needs to be addressed. And my colleagues have also alluded to how that gets addressed. It gets addressed by rational policy making, orthodoxy in fiscal and monetary policy, and orthodoxy also in industrial and labor policies. And that's precisely what has happened in South Africa. With the GNU coming into place, you've got classic commitments to the rule of law, structural reforms, rational policy making in terms of fiscal policies and monetary policies, and all of a sudden, like you correctly point out, the rand has rallied, all our assets have rallied. We project that South Africa will grow at 1.1% this year and 1.9% next year. But if the trends continue and the structural reforms continue, we could be growing at 3% next year. Some of the data supporting that is in our middle market, small businesses, small to medium enterprises. Since the elections, drawdowns are up by 22%. Turnover for our clients is up by about 5%. We've seen Qatar Airlines buying 25% of SA Airlink. We've seen the telcos in our country selling their towers. You've seen investments in multi-choice, the TV's network. My point being, much more activity, much more momentum in structural reforms, and growth of 3% on $400 billion GDP is a big deal. So those propositions are valid. But what I just wanted to advocate for is we do need to thump the table as Africans on this issue of the Africa perception risk premium. It costs us. It costs us South Africa applies Basel III. With South Africa being rated BB-, the added cost in capital for the Standard Bank Group is unconscionable. It's preposterous. But anyway, let me stop there.
No, it's a very valid point, and I think it's a theme that's come up throughout the course of the panel. Samela, we've talked a lot about infrastructure, but I also just want to refer to a report that AFC put out, the State of Africa's Infrastructure Report, and it highlights the disparity in access to electricity. We spoke, and I think the number that the other panelists mentioned is 40% of the continent has an energy deficit, and that is the most significant barrier to industrial growth. But it's interesting to note from this report that you don't only highlight the need to reduce energy poverty, but also the need to build out sustainable energy solutions. So there is a potential there to flip it and turn it into something good and also sustainable over the long run. So tell me how you see the opportunity spanning out there.
So thank you for having me here today, and thanks to the organizers of this event. One of the first events where I don't have to talk about the African opportunity. The honorable ministers have already done that work, by talking about the opportunity. I think the best way for me to intervene is to talk about how to put it all together, because people have said several things, and they've talked about project development, talk about private capital, talk about risk, and all of that. Supply chains, I've had all of those comments. So really, the opportunity for energy or improving energy access in Africa is tremendous. And I'll talk about it, from both the potential and what we have done and what we're doing, to kind of bring it all together. So, true, Africa has, significant potential for solar energy. It's about 10,000 gigawatts of potential with just about 1% that has been built. We have invested in a company called Infinity. It's actually in partnership with Mazda and a few others, and we have 1.4 gigawatts of electricity generation in wind and solar. We're also building a project in Morocco. It's about 10 gigawatts of wind, solar, and storage as well. That is going to provide energy in Morocco as well as to the United Kingdom. And I see that same model of using solar energy in abundance in one location for other locations is happening across the world. I see that Singapore is also going to import energy from Australia. So with this 10,000 gigawatts of solar capacity in Africa, it is a significant opportunity for investment. Africa also has 350 gigawatts of hydroelectricity, with less than, again, 10% of that developed. So what we've done recently is to work with the government in DRC to rehabilitate one of the hydropower dams there, and we're powering a copper mine that's increasing output from 400,000 tons to 650,000 tons. And we're using the hydro energy, to process the copper ores to copper concentrate, and we're building a copper smelter. So we have industrial decarbonization taking place in Africa with renewable energy from Africa. I keep saying that Africa provides the least carbon-intensive part to the energy transition, and the energy systems in Africa can make that happen. Now, why is this possible? It's possible because Africa has high-grade ores. If you look at the largest producers of copper, I think it's Chile, Bolivia, and their concentrate is about 0.6%. In Africa, it is a minimum of 3% and as high as 6%. So 10 times more purity, it means you need less energy for conversion. We're talking about wind as well. Africa has 110 gigawatts of wind potential with just about 10% built, and there are several opportunities to grow. Geothermal energy, 15 gigawatts, with less than 1% built as well. Thermal energy in terms of gas, almost 400 gigawatts. So Africa has abundant energy systems that we can use both for Africa and for the rest of the world. Now, in relation to project development, there's something that we've done recently that I think can be a model going forward. And it will help reduce the execution risk. It will help, of course, governments are important. They need to create the environment for business to thrive. But, there are ways around it. You can't always, this change, is going to take time. So what are we doing in the interim to make things possible? So what we're doing is a partnership, with the government, because we are established by both governments and private capital in Africa. So we're like a hybrid organization that looks at that manages both government and private capital and seeks to deploy that capital for development on the continent. So we recently signed an agreement, with the US PGII, Program for Infrastructure Investment. That's like a G7 initiative with the European Commission as well, and the governments of Angola, DRC, and Zambia to develop a rail corridor, of course, together with the African Development Bank. So the architecture here is working with governments and African institutions and charging African institutions with proven capacity for development to execute. So we have been charged as lead developers to develop this rail corridor that is going to link, DRC, Zambia to Angola, and Angola to the Atlantic Ocean. Recently, the government of Tanzania has joined this same group. They're going to link to the Indian Ocean. So we're going to build an infrastructure that's going to connect the continent, that is going to, I would say, open up and diversify the supply chain for agriculture, for minerals, tourism, and several opportunities. Now, this is an architecture that can be replicated because you need someone to get things done. You can't just rely on government. They will build the capacity over time. But before they build the capacity, let's work with institutions like ourselves that have the capacity. In terms of investment flows as well, we need capital, but we also have institutions like Badia, the Arab Bank of Economic Development in Africa, that is already channeling capital from the Gulf into Africa, and they need to be enhanced. Their capacity needs to be enhanced so that they can do more. Yeah. Ourselves, can have direct access. We have signed MOUs with Saudi Fund for Development, Saudi Exim Bank, and we think that over time we would find ways of connecting the opportunities to the capital and for capital to flow.
Right. We're running out of time. I just want to give the final word to Your Excellency on we've had a really fruitful discussion here about the opportunities and also some of the challenges, but what do you think is at risk if the African continent is left behind?
I don't think that's a risk that we will take or will accept. Africa, I think, will not be left behind. I'm confident. I think all of the inherent capabilities of Africa are too big, too important to leave behind, and the most important is the incredible human resources of Africa, and I think we've seen a sample of the leadership here with us, and in the previous talk before this panel, the young population, the energy, the optimism and enthusiasm of the people, but then there are all of the natural resources. And the world needs Africa as much as Africa needs the world. I think, as we said, renewable energy, agricultural land, mineral resources, human talent, all of that is in short supply as we think of multiple decades ahead. But we've started, and we're starting certainly in the kingdom. We're very active. We just need to converge our financial resources, developmental, multilateral, as well as the bilateral. We need to bring private capital, both by owner-operator companies, and I'm proud that all of the discussion about renewables and energy, one of our national champions is here, and I believe they will talk later on. Aqua Power is one of the most active investors to harness some of that 10 terawatt of electricity in North Africa, Southern Africa. And then we need to bring technology, as I mentioned earlier, telehealth, as Thiam mentioned, remote education to power up this great young population that is ready to take the world on. And I think that we have many risks, but the risk of leaving the entire African continent behind is not one that we're going to accept.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you.
Yeah.
To Jumana and her panel, thank you very, very much. I think if you've been listening throughout the morning, one would easily be forgiven for thinking that we're going